The poker table at the Sapphire Room was surrounded by men who thought they owned the world. It was 1932, and the air hung thick with cigar smoke and arrogance, a combination that had choked better people than Stephanie St. Clair. She approached the table with steady, measured steps, her silk dress catching the amber light from the Art Deco chandeliers overhead. The click of her heels against the hardwood floor announced her arrival before anyone actually looked up to see who was approaching. When they did look up, the laughter started almost immediately. It began with Marcus the banker Rothstein, a corpulent man whose success in loan sharking had given him the mistaken impression that he was somehow superior to everyone else in the room. His laugh was a wet, phlegmy sound that seemed to come from deep in his throat, and it set off a chain reaction around the table. Vincent DeLuca joined in next, his gold teeth flashing in the low light as he elbowed the man next to him. Within seconds, all 6 men at the table were laughing, their voices creating a cacophony of masculine derision that was designed to make Stephanie turn around and walk away. She didn't. Instead, she pulled out the empty chair, the 7th seat at the table, and sat down with the kind of deliberate grace that suggested she had every right to be there. The dealer, a thin, nervous man named Raymond, who had worked at the Sapphire Room for 3 years, looked uncertainly between Stephanie and the other players, his hands hovering over the deck of cards as if frozen in indecision. Marcus wiped tears from his eyes, his laughter finally subsiding enough for him to speak. "Oh, honey, I think you got the wrong room. The ladies' auxiliary meets downstairs on Thursdays. This here is a serious game, high stakes. We're talking real money, not the kind of cash you'd find in a lady's purse." Vincent leaned back in his chair, his expensive suit straining against his frame. "Maybe she's looking for someone. You looking for your husband, sweetheart? Or maybe your daddy. This ain't no place for a woman, no matter how pretty she is." The others chimed in with their own commentary, each comment designed to diminish and dismiss. They talked about her as if she wasn't sitting right there, as if she was some kind of curiosity that had wandered into their masculine domain by mistake. They questioned whether she even knew the rules of poker, whether she could count her cards, whether she understood that this wasn't like the friendly games that ladies might play at their social clubs. Stephanie waited. She placed her handbag carefully on the small shelf beneath the table's edge, then folded her hands in front of her, her expression as calm as a still pond on a windless day. She didn't defend herself, didn't argue, didn't try to justify her presence. She simply existed in that space, taking up the chair she had chosen, and waited for the laughter to run its course the way you wait for a summer storm to pass. When the noise finally died down, she looked directly at the dealer and said in a voice that carried clearly despite its softness, "I'd like to buy in. $50,000 to start." The laughter stopped completely. $50,000 in 1932 was the kind of money that could buy 3 houses, 5 cars, or fund a small business for years. It was serious money, the kind that commanded respect whether it came from a man or a woman, whether it was held in a leather wallet or a silk purse. Raymond the dealer looked to Marcus, who had become the unofficial authority at the table, by virtue of having the most money and the loudest voice. Marcus's smile had frozen on his face, caught somewhere between amusement and uncertainty. He exchanged glances with Vincent, then with the other players, silently negotiating whether to allow this woman to actually play. "You got that kind of money on you right now?" Marcus asked, his tone skeptical but no longer openly mocking. Stephanie opened her handbag and removed 5 neat stacks of bills, each one bound with a paper band that read $10,000 in printed text. She placed them on the table in front of her with the same casual ease that another person might place down a newspaper. The money sat there, undeniably real, undeniably substantial, and undeniably hers. The dynamic at the table shifted in that moment. Money has a way of commanding attention that transcends gender, race, or any other superficial category that people use to divide the world into us and them. These men were gamblers and hustlers, and they recognized real capital when they saw it. More importantly, they recognized an opportunity. A woman with $50,000 who didn't know what she was doing could be separated from that money very quickly, and they could split it 6 ways and still walk away with a significant profit for the evening. Marcus nodded slowly, his decision made. "All right then, Raymond, cash the lady in. Let's play some poker." The first hand was dealt. Stephanie picked up her cards with practiced ease, fanning them out just enough to see what she held without revealing anything to the other players. Her face remained neutral, giving nothing away. The betting started conservatively, everyone feeling out the table, trying to get a sense of how this new dynamic would play out. Stephanie folded on the first hand. She folded on the second hand as well, and the third. For the first 45 minutes, she played with extreme caution, putting in the minimum bets when required, folding early when the betting got serious, and generally playing like someone who was out of her depth and knew it. The men at the table started to relax, their initial caution giving way to confidence. They began to chat amongst themselves again, trading jokes and stories, occasionally throwing comments in Stephanie's direction that ranged from patronizing to outright condescending. "You sure you want to keep playing, honey? You're down almost 8,000 already. Maybe cut your losses while you can still afford cab fare home," Vincent suggested with mock concern. Stephanie smiled politely and said nothing, just waited for the next hand to be dealt. She was studying them, cataloguing every tell, every nervous habit, every pattern of behavior that might give her an edge. Marcus touched his wedding ring when he was bluffing. Vincent's left eye twitched slightly when he had a strong hand. The man to her right, a real estate developer named Theodore, always arranged his chips in neat stacks when he was about to fold. Each player had their tells, their unconscious signals that broadcast their intentions to anyone patient enough to watch and observant enough to understand. The turning point came an hour and 20 minutes into the game. The pot had grown to $32,000, the largest of the night so far. 4 players remained in the hand: Marcus, Vincent, Theodore, and Stephanie. The community cards showed a king of spades, a king of hearts, a 7 of clubs, a 2 of diamonds, and a queen of spades. It was a dangerous board, the kind where a hidden trips or a full house could be lurking in someone's hand. Marcus bet 15,000, a substantial raise that was designed to push people out of the pot. Vincent called without hesitation, which meant he either had something very strong or was committed to the bluff he'd been building. Theodore thought for a long moment, his fingers hovering over his chips before finally folding with visible reluctance. That left Stephanie. She looked at her cards one more time, then at the pot, then at Marcus, then at Vincent. The entire table seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what the woman who had been playing scared all night would do when faced with this decision. "I'll raise," Stephanie said calmly, and pushed all of her remaining chips into the center of the table. All in. 43,000. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus's hand moved unconsciously to his wedding ring, twisting it nervously. Vincent's eye didn't twitch at all, which was interesting in itself. The other players who had already folded leaned in closer, suddenly very interested in how this hand would resolve. Marcus studied Stephanie's face, trying to find some tell, some hint of what she was holding. He found nothing. Her expression was as serene and unreadable as it had been when she first sat down, when they had all been laughing at her. He looked at his own cards again, then at the pot, calculating odds and possibilities in his head. "Too rich for my blood," Marcus said finally, tossing his cards face down toward the dealer. "I fold." Vincent stared at the pile of chips in the center of the table. $75,000, give or take. It was more money than most people would see in a lifetime. He looked at his cards one more time, looked at Stephanie, then back at his cards. "I call," he said, pushing his chips forward to match her bet. The dealer spoke the ritual words. "Show your hands." Vincent turned over his cards with a flourish, ace of spades, king of clubs, trip kings with an ace kicker. It was a powerful hand, the kind that wins most pots. He started to smile, started to reach for the chips, when Stephanie calmly turned over her own cards. King of diamonds, king of hearts. She had quad kings, 4 of a kind, one of the strongest hands in poker. The odds of getting 4 of a kind are approximately 4,000 to 1. The odds of getting 4 of a kind and having the patience to slow play it perfectly while reading the table well enough to extract maximum value are incalculable. Vincent's face went pale. Marcus made a strangled sound in the back of his throat. The other players simply stared, unable to quite process what had just happened. Stephanie reached forward and began stacking the chips in front of her with methodical efficiency. organizing her winnings the way a librarian might organize books, each stack precise and neat. She played 3 more hours after that hand. The laughter never returned. Instead, a tense, almost fearful silence settled over the table, broken only by the necessary communications of betting and folding. Stephanie won some hands, lost others, but her stack of chips grew steadily larger. More importantly, the psychological dynamic had completely inverted. The men who had mocked her when she sat down now treated her with wary respect. The kind of respect that comes from recognizing a predator and realizing you might be the prey. She took particular pleasure in crushing Marcus in a hand, where she turned a straight against his flush draw that never materialized, costing him $18,000 that he had been counting on to recoup his earlier losses. She systematically exploited Vincent's eye twitch, calling his bluffs with weak hands and folding when the twitch appeared, saving herself thousands of dollars in the process. She read Theodore's chip-stacking tell so effectively that he eventually stopped playing entirely, just sitting at the table nursing his whiskey and watching the carnage unfold. By midnight, Stephanie had accumulated over $200,000 in chips. She had broken 3 of the 6 players completely, forcing them to leave the table with empty pockets and wounded pride. The other 3 were hanging on by their fingernails, playing scared poker, making tight folds, afraid to confront this woman who had seemed so harmless just hours before. At 12:30, Stephanie stood up. She gathered her chips and walked to the cashier's window, where she converted them into neat stacks of bills that she placed carefully in her handbag. The remaining players watched her go, their faces showing a mixture of relief and humiliation. They had been completely outplayed by the person they had dismissed, the woman they had laughed at, and the sting of that realization was going to last a lot longer than the financial losses. As Stephanie walked toward the exit, Marcus called out to her, his voice hoarse from cigars and defeat. "You hustled us. You knew how to play the whole time. You were just setting us up." Stephanie stopped and turned back to face him. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't offer any of the triumphant mockery that he and his friends had heaped upon her when she first arrived. She simply looked at him with those calm, intelligent eyes and said, "I sat down at a table where I had every right to sit. You chose to laugh. You chose to assume I was incompetent, based on nothing more than my gender. You chose to underestimate me because it made you feel superior. I didn't hustle you, Marcus. You hustled yourselves. I just played poker while you played at being superior." She turned back toward the door, her heels clicking against the floor with the same steady rhythm they had made when she entered. But this time, no one was laughing. This time, the sound of her footsteps echoed in complete silence, a metronome marking the passage of a night when 6 men learned a lesson that would cost them dearly, and that they would never forget. The story of that night spread through the gambling circles of the city like wildfire. People talked about the woman who had walked into the Sapphire Room and walked out with $200,000. They talked about how she had sat there and absorbed the mockery without flinching, how she had played weak for over an hour before revealing her true skill, how she had systematically dismantled players who had been gambling for decades. Some people said she had cheated, because that was easier than admitting she had simply outplayed everyone at the table. Some said she had been lucky, because acknowledging her skill would mean confronting their own prejudices about what women could and couldn't do. But the people who had been there, who had seen her face when she turned over those 4 kings, who had watched her read players like they were open books, those people knew the truth. Stephanie Saint. Claire had sat down at that table as an equal, even though she was treated as less than. And when she stood up, she stood as a champion, having proved with chips and cards what should never have needed proving, that competence has no gender, that skill respects no artificial boundaries, and that the people who laugh at you when you sit down often have nothing to say when you stand up and walk away with everything they thought they owned. Marcus lost his house 6 months later, part of a cascade of bad decisions and worse luck that started the night he underestimated a woman in a silk dress. Vincent developed a permanent twitch in both eyes, a psychological scar that made poker impossible for him to play professionally ever again. Theodore gave up gambling entirely and moved to a small town upstate where nobody knew about the night he got destroyed at cards by someone he had considered beneath him. And Stephanie. She used that $200,000 to fund a network of businesses that would eventually make her one of the wealthiest and most powerful figures in the city's underground economy. She never forgot the laughter she heard when she sat down at that table, and she never let anyone underestimate her again. But more importantly, she never forgot the lesson of that night, that the people who judge you by your appearance, your gender, or your background are giving you the greatest gift possible. They're showing you their weakness, their blind spots, their inability to see what's really in front of them. And if you're patient enough, smart enough, and skilled enough, you can use that gift to take everything they have while they're still laughing at jokes that were never funny to begin with.